Oh, wait. Is preparing the live stream to the webinar.
Is it prepared?
And we're live.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next panel. My name is OmiSoore Dryden. I'll be moderating the panel. I just want to say that I currently work and live in Chubuktuk, Halifax, the traditional unceded territory of the Maliseet, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and the Passamaquoddy nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. This was roughly 140 years before the end of slavery in this region we now call Canada. Halifax was imposed upon Chubuktuk in 1749, and enslaved African people were used to dig up the roads and build the city, including much of the citadel. On the southern shore of the Bedford Basin, Mi'kmaq folks shared land with Black people, and this is what allowed Africville to be founded in the mid-1800s. I also want to acknowledge our benevolent collective ancestors, Indigenous, Black, queer, trans, genderqueer, and two-spirit, who were born here, forced here, and continue to make home here. And we are going to get started. I have the very, very great pleasure of moderating this discussion with Erica Violet Lee and Elle Jones. This teach-in will focus on the current context for Black and Indigenous people in this country as they confront and resist the ongoing racist, colonial, and colonial violence perpetrated in and by police and other militarized and carceral institutions. Let me introduce our speakers. Erica Violet Lee is a writer based in Treaty 6 territory, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. As a community organizer, she works with the Indigenous Joint Action Coalition, I Don't Know More, Indigenous Climate Action, and Chug Cherry Studios. Erica holds a Master's of Education from OISE at the University of Toronto and has a BA in Political Theory from the University of Saskatchewan. Her work focuses on Indian feminist freedoms, movements, and pleasure. I love that. And she tweets at Erica Violet Lee. And Elle Jones is a poet, educator, journalist, and advocate. She was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax and the 15th Nancy's Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. Elle is a 2016 recipient of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission Burnley Rocky Jones Award. Elle is a co-founder of Black Power Hour, a radio show developed collectively with prisoners. Her advocacy and her work fights anti-Black racism in Canada, walking in the path of our great-grandmothers who resist relentlessly. Her book of poetry and essays on state violence, Canada is So Polite, will be released in the winter from Gaspereau Press. Thank you both. It's great to see you. It's great that we're doing this.
Thank you.
So, I'm just gonna ask, what does resistance and refusal of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous colonial violence look like? And what does it mean to abolish and to liberate? Because those are easy questions, but let's start there. What do you think? Who wants to go first?
I guess my mic's off.
No, it's on now.
I mean, on, that's what I meant. So I guess I'm going first because I made the mistake of turning my mic on to say thank you. So what are the questions? Resist, refusal, liberate, and abolition?
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay, so there goes an hour and a half. I wanna start with this notion of refusal because I think that's very relevant to what we're doing right now because we're supposed to be saying no in this moment, right? We're doing a scholars strike, but of course, most of us are just doing more work in this context, right? So I actually want to talk about that, what refusal of work actually looks like for Black people, for example, where the whole notion of Blackness is based upon labor and our movement, our forced movement to become forced labor, right? So we have no understanding of Blackness in the Americas, at least, or in you know, that in the context of enslavement, that doesn't involve going back to this notion of we were property and we continue to be propertized in particular ways, right? We're still seen as public property as Black people, so we can be appropriated from. We're still seen as providing free labor. We're still exploitable in these particular ways. For Black women, you know, the reproductive labor that's also exploited, and, you know, we can go into that. So in that context, refusal is actually very difficult for Black people because our condition is one of constant labor. As a Black woman in the academy who's precariously employed, I actually am not in a position to say, yeah, cool, I'm just not gonna work for 2 days at the beginning of the term. Like, no, you know, obviously I have to get my stuff online. I have to talk to my students because I'm in a precarious position where a bad review can mean I'm not back next semester. And then what do I do to pay my bills? You know, I have no savings, I have no leave, stuff like that. So are we actually refusing? And then what does it mean for Black people when we're trying to resist, but so much of our resistance is co-opted and we don't have a position to refuse that? So I think about in this moment, we talk a lot about, you know, the neoliberal system or white supremacy, but what's harder to talk about, for example, is the people standing beside us in our movements who are also selling our resistance to other people. So whether that's, you know, corporate initiatives that won't talk about divesting from the police or divesting, you know, from pipelines that they are invested in, but then saying, oh yeah, like Black Lives Matter, we're going to get more corporate people in the boardroom. And you're like, but are you actually going to take your money out of the things that fund militarizing, that fund weapons, that fund pipelines, that fund all this conflict, that fund policing? No, you know, and how do we refuse that in the context of resistance, where sometimes our resistance is in itself being used to not push those things down, but to pull them up? And then that takes me to liberation, which I think is really, I'm trying to do all four of these, OmiSoore. So I think for me, that's always where my work wants to live. So sometimes we end this discourse of civil rights, but that's a discourse of inclusion that I don't believe in. I don't believe in a discourse of diversity. I have no desire to sit at a table. I have no desire to eat crumbs from somebody else. I have no desire to be, you know, part of a system that we know is built upon the refusal of most of us, and the majority of us living in poverty, the majority of us living with mental illness, those of us who are incarcerated, those of us with no housing, those of us who cannot be well or have any well-being on a daily basis. There is no system of liberation that involves me having tenure and therefore we're liberated, or this person being in the boardroom and therefore we're liberated, or we have a prime minister and therefore we're liberated. This work requires us to do things like fight our Black immigration minister that when we were fighting Abdul Abdi, and a lot of people were like, but he's Black, and we're like, but he's still deporting Black people. So that's not going to be where our liberation is found. It's going to have to be found in something else outside of this system, and that's what leads us into abolition. So a lot of people are becoming comfortable with this language of defunding right now, because it's still capitalist, right? Like we can still just be like, oh, you could, no, okay, we get it. Money goes somewhere else. We just take money from police, we give it to social workers, but that's still part of a system. That's still, we know that white women who are largely social workers were the teachers in residential schools. White women were the missionaries. White women were the co-oppressors in colonization, right? So moving to those systems of carceral care, as Adil talks about a lot, Adil Abdullahi, is not going to be a form of abolition. When we're talking about abolition, we actually have to talk about rethinking those relationships. So rethinking our relationship to land, rethinking our relationship to capitalism, which again is where racism is grounded for Black people. Slavery and racism go hand in hand. So we know that, I mean, slavery and capitalism go hand in hand. And we know that as Black people, we are not going to find liberation in a capitalist system that still sees our bodies as property. You know, patriarchy, we're not going to see liberation in a patriarchal system that still sees the bodies of Black women, of femmes, as exploitable, as sexually exploitable. That we're not going to find it in a system that treats trans bodies as a place to be policed, as we're seeing with Caster Semenya being refused at the Supreme Court of Switzerland because her body doesn't fit into certain regulations, and that kind of policing that's happening so intimately for Black women across the world. So all of those are involved in abolition. It's not just about even just saying get rid of policing. It's about getting rid of those ideologies of punishment, those ideologies of capitalism, the ideologies of extraction, the ideologies of exploitation. And the last thing I'll say, sorry, Erica, this is a long answer, that in the academy, we also need to accomplish those things. So I think there's a lot of discourse even around, oh, you know, scholars strike, those people don't do any work in the first place, you know, but we also have to think about how complicit the academy is in all of these systems, whether that's cops on campus and the ways that university are securitized and increasingly securitized, whether that's in, you look at fields like, say, criminology, where you can't do research inside a prison unless CSC says this research benefits us. So we have a whole field of academic research with complicit REB boards, right, ethics boards that aren't passing research if CSC won't pass it, but like the prison gets to dictate what we understand about prisons and what academic research looks like. And of course, you're never going to walk up to prison and say, I really want to study how Black prisoners organize. I really want to study the importance of a conversion to Islam in prison for Black political consciousness, like that doesn't benefit them. So all of those understandings and researches that are complicit in the ways the academy holds that up as the real research and won't give you approval is actually part of a prison system and holding that. We have to talk about that. We have to talk about things like the surveillance systems, technologies now around exam writing, where we're using facial recognition technologies to identify students under this idea of surveying people for cheating. And especially as we're like online in COVID, which is this new opportunity for people to see that as a surveillance space. So we're getting emails from university. I notice people haven't uploaded this stuff onto their websites and, onto your course sites. Like, why are you looking at us? But this gaze that is more and more descending on us through technology in the university, that the same technology is being used out on the streets to police people, and the same technology is being used in the prison. So we really have to think about, as Angela Davis has identified, how the prison always moves outwards. Something starts in the prison, and then it comes into the so-called free world, and the free world becomes a prison. So I'm not saying academia is a prison. I would never, we're never going to be like, oh, it's like being in lockdown. That's a really gross analogy, right? Like the prison is the prison. But what we know about the prison is the techniques of surveillance that exist in the prison then come to us through these notions of safety or security or these other things that are supposed to keep us safe. And we're seeing this in the academy right now, where we're using those same kind of policing technologies under this notion of fairness. So we also have to talk about how these institutions are carceral institutions in particular ways and do take part in that. And we have to resist that. We have to refuse that. We have to liberate ourselves from that. And when we're talking about abolition, it means all of those things. So what would it be like to abolish this system of education that charges people so much and puts them into debt? What would free education, liberated education for the people look like, that teaches us how to organize for our well-being? That is part of abolition as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. Thank you.
And we're done.
Right? So how are the rest of you doing now? That was absolute fire. And here comes more fire. Erica.
Okay, so the themes were resistance,
Yes.
refusal, liberation, and abolition.
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing that I think of when I think of resistance, and thank you, Elle, for that amazing answer. I was just on the verge of like crying, and I'll probably cry at some point. But resistance, so often Black and Indigenous women and Black and Indigenous people in general are made to be resilient and be resistant, and that's sort of all we're seen as good for. And it's another like analogy regarding like a beast of burden, right? Our labor and our lands are good for something and useful for something, but the second we step on the scene, they don't want our voices, they don't want our actual thoughts. They want us to sit on their committees and be tokens. And I, as an Indigenous undergrad, experienced that, where like presidents of the universities were calling me in as an undergrad, like in my second and third year, to talk to me about how do we indigenize the academy. And my response even then was always, go to the Indigenous faculty. You have an entire like Indigenous faculty over there. So why aren't you talking to them? Why are you talking to, like, it's not like an undergrad doesn't have anything to offer. It's that the labor of senior faculty and junior faculty, people with the credentials, both community-based and academic, are the ones being pushed aside because it's not as friendly. And then growing up in the context of the prairies, Black erasure is something I dealt with my entire life. And just learning, being lucky enough to come to Toronto and learn from so many of the like top, most amazing Black scholars I've ever met. And I think about refusal in that term, Adil Abdullahi and Ronaldo Walcott's new book, Black Life. And there's this, it starts by saying, we're bored of Canada. And that, I think of that like every week, at least once. We're bored of Canada. We're bored of returning to the scene of the crime and trying to redeem it. So that's what I think of refusal. Liberation. reading Black women's literature, Black feminist literature, Black trans literature has been a major source of me realizing that the conceptions I held of decolonization were flawed and incomplete without Black liberation. And so from people like Saidiya Hartman, Adrienne Maree Brown, Christina Sharp, endless names I could think of. I've learned Robin Maynard. I've learned to think about joy and pleasure in a way that is not necessarily sexual, but in a way that is the ability to live our lives the way we choose, which is ultimately the goal of this whole project, right? And fill our head spaces with the things we want our head spaces to be filled with, and not the fact that I can't sleep at night because there's a police helicopter that goes around the neighborhood in Saskatoon. Yeah.
Thank you. And wow, right? Like a police helicopter around the. So the thing I want to talk about, or I want to ask us to think through now are, this, so I agree, right? As Elle, you were saying, Angela Davis is saying that, the prison moves outwards, right? Like becomes into our communities. While at the same time, Erica, as you were saying, that, the simultaneous wanting and not wanting of our labor, wanting and not wanting of us in a particular space. But I'm also thinking about, the use of the panopticon, the way in which there's a surveillance of how we ourselves move in the institution, and how we see that surveillance not only causing harm outside the institution and inside the institution, but outside the institution, not only causing harm, but causing death. Here I'm thinking about Chantel Moore, and I'm thinking about Regis Karczynski-Paquette, and the ways in which their bodies and their themselves, right, their personhood was policed in a way that resulted in both of them dying, not at all receiving any kind of help, but how we also carry that policing on the university, in the classroom, in our Zoom classes, whether we're on campus physically or on campus virtually with our colleagues, the kind of expectation of us, not only before this time, like there was a before, but during this time with these increase of university statements of solidarity, increase of the, we need to talk about the violence that Black and Indigenous people face now and every moment. Reflect on that for me. Talk about the ways in which, we are pushing against the panopticon in so many, in all the ways that we show up both inside and outside the institution.
You ask easy questions, OmiSoore. I think where I want to start, and I'm really glad that Erica, you really brought up joy and pleasure as a really important dimension of what resistance is, because so often being in, these bodies and these skins as we walk around is of course a source of violence, and the source of that violence becoming spectacle, right? So I think about what's happened with Regis, who is a person, who was a woman, an Afro-Indigenous woman, and even in terms of when we try to resist and inquire into what happened, it becomes this forensic autopsy, right? So now we're talking about the bone in her body, and like we as Black people start reducing her down to, well, here's this autopsy, and we're dissecting the body, and this bone wasn't here, and this bruise on the body, and it becomes the case and the body. And we, in our attempts to hold this system accountable that will never be accountable because it's not built to be accountable and it's built to kill us, in our attempts to try to still create something out of that, we end up in this language around, if we just have the right report, and like if we can just dissect this woman's body in the right way, we might be able to find an answer. Except the answer is not going to be found on Regis's body or within an autopsy, because the answer is in an ideology of punishment in society. The answer is not in her body at all, because it's not about her in that sense. And I don't mean that it's not about the grief of her family or her loss, but we know that policing is not an event. It's not never a moment. It's a long, long process. Policing is a process that, in North America involves, the arrival of colonization, right? Like that is policing. Moving people to reserves is policing. Quite literally, the RCMP are founded in this kind of colonial policing, like literally a frontier police, literally returning kids to residential schools. This is not metaphor, right? Like policing is literally connected to this process of taming the wild, both through literally killing Indigenous people and committing genocide, and then that connected to all these notions of how the land itself is wild and has to be tamed in the same ways, and then extracted and made, something that you can get profit from endlessly, right? And we're doing the same thing to Regis's body, right? We're extracting from it in our kind of quest to say, like, we can answer to policing these particular ways. And that isn't the answer, right? This is still a kind of form of trying to be reformist, because it's still a form of engaging in this way of speaking about ourselves, speaking about who we are, speaking about how we move. That's still this idea of, like this very objective enlightenment kind of idea is of like, if we can debate our way, we just need to debate our way with the police. And if we can like debate this, then, maybe people will finally believe we're human. And, maybe if we can find the right, we've all been in that position, right? With our colleagues or whoever, where I used to very much feel this when I was younger, and I'd be trying to deal with like racist colleagues or whatever. And I would always go home feeling like, if I'd only said this, I've only said that, if I'd only cited this, if I'd only, and I would take it very much upon myself. And it took me a long time to realize that the burden wasn't mine. There was nothing I could say or do, because the problem was not in me. The problem was in the institution. It was in the people who were racist, and it was like their thing to work out. And so that's always our issue, that we want to turn to, I think, our intelligence and our intellect, even in particular ways, that is still bound up in this very colonial way of thinking. I really like, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name, and that's awful, on Canada Reads, where she made the point about Jesse Thistle's book, and not Jesse Thistle himself, and I'm so sorry, and if everyone knows the name, I'm really sorry to be blanking on the name right now, that's the worst. But she made this wonderful point about, but why do we need people to be redeemed in particular ways, right? Like, why does the story have to end with a PhD and a professorship? Why can't it end with going back on the land and decolonizing yourself and finding yourself in that way? I'm really questioning a very serious narrative that we even have about education, right? Like what it looks like, how we think of it as our salvation in particular ways. Like for Black people, where that's the up from slavery narrative, where my mother had to leave her home at 14 years old, 15 years old, go to England to get an education that she could not get in Trinidad, where she grew up still under colonization, and experienced this incredibly traumatic displacement. Her father died, she couldn't go home, couldn't go home for years. In the end, I think very much dislocated us on purpose, because she didn't want us living in two worlds. So she really made a choice to remove us from that part of like our heritage. And I didn't go to Trinidad to visit until I was 13 years old. That's the first time I saw my grandmother, and I think those are choices my mother made because of the difficulty of trying to cross that boundary and trying to live in two ways, and thought I have to commit to living in, this country, in England and then in Canada, and living in this particular way. So I just think about that, that in this narrative of education, which is what saves us, what brings us out of poverty, for my mother, what brought my family out of like third world, as they say, poverty, right? Like where you had nothing, and you ground your way into school, and then you studied all night, and you did well on these British exams. And if you managed to do that, then maybe you could pull the next generation out. But I think we really have to rethink that. Like, what is this education for? Are we here to perform autopsies on culture? Are we here to perform autopsies on ourselves? Are we here to forensically break these things down? And I always think about this in terms of even abolition, right? Like how often, especially in Canada, it's very white and it's very academic, right? Most of the abolitionists are academics, and people that are living in communities that are facing violence aren't having discussions on abolition, not because they're not capable, but because it's not being brought to people where we're actually sitting down in community and saying, what does crime mean to you? What does violence mean to you? What have you experienced? We aren't actually doing that work. And then we treat something like Fanon or Angela Davis or Ruthie Gilmore as something to be read in the classroom, and not something that's actually an urgent guide to living. Right. So then more white people have read that stuff and they're conversing in it. And our own people are like, I can't read Fanon. I don't know what that means. And I'm like, but this was actually written for you in the middle of the struggle. Fanon was writing while he was fighting on the ground and bringing us this material. It wasn't for the classroom, it was for the struggle. You know, and now we're so disconnected from that we can't even read the work given to us by our freedom fighters, even though the greatest intellect of Black people over 5 centuries has been devoted to this cause of how do we get free? When the soldiers show up, how do you get rid of them? How do you get these people off your land? How do you fight them in your brain? How do you fight them in your heart? How do you fight them in your home? You know, how do we find love for ourselves? So that was a really long answer because you asked a really like complex question. But
I'm gonna try to ask this.
Go ahead, Erica.
I'm trying to keep up the two of you. That's why I'm like trying to come up with these questions that you'll find interesting and intriguing. Thank you, Percy. I believe the name you're looking for is Kenhieto?
Yes.
Horn. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm saying their name incorrectly.
Ganadeo.
Oh, of course.
Ganadeo Horn. Yeah.
Ganadeo Horn. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. Erica.
Yeah, I really appreciated what Elle said about how we view the academy as something to keep us safe, and how for Black and Indigenous people and people of color, disabled people, people who are trans or gender non-conforming, that is not the case at all. And yet still we're told at every route, and I know this especially from the point of a like Indigenous woman. One of the first songs I ever learned in school was this song that goes, go my son, go and climb that mountain, get your education, make your people proud of you. And I like remember that song so well because we played it every single day in like preschool. And so yeah, it took me a long time too to get to the point where I realized, and I remember it was the day before I got my grad school acceptance to OISE. I thought there is more to life than this, and I like can't forget that there's more to life than getting into school. And if I don't get into school, I'm still a good person. But like how deep that respectability politic goes to convince us that we need school, that we need formalized Western education in order to be good, productive citizens, whatever that means. And I remember talking to an older scholar at one point while I was really struggling through my philosophy degree and the components of it that were required, like symbolic logic. So, and really struggling through that and talking to a senior academic who said, yeah, but this stuff is really important for us to learn because that way we can speak back when people speak badly about us. And thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want to be that kind of scholar. I don't want to like have to only survive in my scholarship or in my writing. And obviously that's done out of necessity. It's done out of the first wave of Indigenous, first and second waves of Indigenous scholars actually entering the academy, and having to be able to defend, having to be able to know both the entire Western canon, so we can prove our worthiness of being in that space, and then at the same time trying to find time during the day to do what actually drives us to be an intellectual or a thinker or a freedom fighter in the first place.
Thank you. Sorry, my mic was off. You know, I'm thinking about two questions. Both have been suggested. So thank you both to Roslyn and Adele. And so one question, I'm going to ask them both so you can talk about them. I believe they're connected. Or they can be connected. So one question is about, you know, how do we manage the tensions involved in living abolitionist politics, right? So how do we kind of manage, you know, having to engage in, for example, harm reduction with the system, while also at the same time wanting to completely dismantle the system? So how do we do that? And then, the other question is, what does it mean for Black and Indigenous people to have audacity in the academy? So let's start with those two. Erica.
I was reading and thinking about the question there, so I missed the first part of the question.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. So yes, because those questions in the chat. The other question from Rosalind, thank you, was speaking further about the contradictions involved in living our abolitionist politics. How do we deal with the tensions or the compromises? Yeah.
I feel like Elle and I are probably going to be on the same page on this one. I don't think you can. I think that we have to abolish the academy and what it looks like right now. At the same time, like, I recognize that puts people in such precarious positions, but the reality is most of us are in precarious positions anyway. We've been put in precarious positions anyway. Getting a master's degree didn't magically make my life easier. It didn't make me able to pay bills. It didn't make my family any poorer, any less poor. So ultimately, I would like, it's never the theory that I regret doing or learning. It's never the people I meet in these spaces that I regret. Well, sometimes, but I think that ultimately the structure has to fall in order for, and the Undercommons is a great guide for this, by Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey.
Yeah, I think we're all complicit. And I think a lot about how our own desires are counter-abolitionists, right? The things that we want to need, which go beyond security, right? I think we want everybody to be safe, but not safe in the notion of public safety, right? So this public safety office we have that is guns, gangs, drugs, deportations, under this notion of safety. And we know that who's always been left out of safety is queer people, trans people, sex workers, people who are living on the streets, Black people, Indigenous people. We have never been in this notion of the public that needs to be protected, and our safety can be compromised in order to keep other people safe, right? This is the whole notion of policing in the first place, right? That we're the collateral damage to this mythical notion of public safety. But, I think abolition always asks us to think about this differently. And we think about safety as, what if everybody had a home that was safe? What if everybody had food that was safe and secure? What if everybody was able to deal with conflict in their community without having to turn to somebody from outside your community, like the police or a social worker that was going to come in and re-victimize you and criminalize you and incarcerate you or punish you in particular ways, right? So, we hold that up as an ideal, but at the same time, we know that we desire many of the things that are implicit in, or that are part of capitalism, right? Like, I want a house, I wish I had a garden and I could garden, I want vacations, I want nice clothes. We want those things. And in the wanting of them, of course, we betray our own values over and over and over again. Anybody who says, I really like when Leanne Simpson talks about, of course I want my book to sell and I want all the retweets and I want all these things, of course we want those things. So we can talk as abolitionists in this kind of pure way, when we overthrow capitalism, but of course we're all invested in it. And it's dealing with that. I don't think we ever do come to terms with that. I think what abolition asks us is to do that kind of steady self-reflection, right? To recognize how far we are from the things we want and how complicit we are, because we have to be in the systems that we know are harmful, but yet take part in every day. And that's not a kind of, again, punitive thing where you're like, gotcha, you did this thing over here and you said you're an abolitionist, because it is a process. I think it's about trying to come into a different world. As Rachel Zellas always says, if the prison fell tomorrow, if somebody just literally came and opened, we ain't ready, that wouldn't work. We're not ready. We don't know how to deal with harm. We don't know how to deal with conflict. We have no solution for dealing with people who are harming us. We have no solution for the harm we've done to other people. We have no idea how to deal with these issues in our communities. We don't even deal with them in our friend circles, if we're honest, right? We don't even know in the people closest to us how to have conflict and in a healthy way, right? We're still saying I don't fuck with you, we're not able to work those things out because we have no training, no ability, the ways that we haven't been taught how to live in community with each other. So nobody's practically saying like, we just think these things will be abolished tomorrow and then we'll know what to do. What we're saying is we try to work to it in new ways every day. And what does that look like? And in some social ways, it looks like the fact that this isn't a myth. We know during COVID, we let out in this province, almost 50% of people came out of jail during COVID because it became a public health threat. And we were able to house people at like half the price of jail, and society didn't collapse. Right. So we know that we've shown, the system itself shows that you don't need jail to keep you safe in these particular ways. It turned out we can house people who don't have homes in hotels, something we were always told we couldn't do, but we could do. So what it showed us is these things that we're talking about aren't imaginary. We're not fantasists where we sit here and we just dream of this world and everyone goes, well, that world will never exist, because it existed when we needed it to exist. But the point is, how do we keep bringing that into existence? And that's not just something where we can sit and theorize about it. We have to actually live it out. And that means, yes, we have to learn how to make changes in ourselves. We have to learn how to make changes in our hearts, in our homes, in the ways we relate to each other. And then we have to be honest. I'm not a hashtag abolitionist. I don't believe in just saying like hashtag abolition, let's abolish this, and then acting like it's easy. It's very, very complex. I'm sort of answering the question about, also like, well, what about, like if I live in a community where there's harm? And that's a real question. What about victims? It's often women who are asked to forgive and move on. We know that, right? Or get over it. Like, there's a small period of time where you're like held up as a victim. And then once you go too far with that, it's like, okay, like now we've had enough of that. Shut up. Like, and we know that that's very gendered. Women are asked to forgive. Women and like queer people and trans people asked to forego. Indigenous and Black people never get justice. Like we get truth and reconciliation commissions, right? Like, oh, just forgive your abuser. Historically, we're not even allowed to hold people to account. And like, so I'm not into a discourse that just says everyone needs to forgive before we've had justice, before you've even had accountability. And I don't believe we can just talk about that and ignore harm. I don't believe we can just say victims will somehow just, find another way, because right now this is the way we have. And you can't just say to somebody, don't call the cops on your rapist, or, don't put your abuser in prison because prisons are wrong. That's not an actual good answer. And it's not a compassionate answer. It's actually not a humane answer. We need to work together to something else and talk about what harm actually looks like and what actually is accountability. And what does that actually mean in real ways? And why do we want punishment? And why are we investing in it? And are there better ways to think about that? And that's going to be a long process. So I think we actually lean into those areas. I don't think they're actually gotcha questions. Like, I'm not an abolitionist because I'm on Twitter, I'm not an abolitionist because then, it's like a t-shirt. And I'm not an abolitionist in the sense that I'm scared of when someone says, but what about people who murder people? Or what about dangerous sex offenders? Those are real questions. They're not just gotcha questions. And they're things that we have to challenge ourselves with. I know nobody who does work in prisons that isn't challenged by those questions in particular ways. It isn't like, that person concerns me, I feel uncomfortable with that. And that's actually the work, leaning into those spaces, really being honest with ourselves, being honest about harm, being honest about the ways we harm, being honest about the ways we want to punish, and then working together to think up something new. This has been a 500-year plus system. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and Black and Indigenous people have the answers, so therefore we should shut up and let the system continue. We need to say it's not working. We don't have all the answers because we haven't even had a chance. We haven't had a chance to care for ourselves, never mind come up with a whole way of caring for a new society, but we are in the act of doing it. We're in the act of doing it when people are out on the land. We're in the act of doing it when people are marching together. Those are everyday actions. So I believe in those. And I don't actually think the contradictions that make us not live our values in that sense. I think it's the complexity that is important.
It was Mia Mingus speaking at a conference I was at in the States, clearly many years ago, who had raised that question, right? So we're talking about abolition of prisons. We think this is important. We are committed to it. But what are we going to do with these people, or people who have committed these, very atrocious harms? And it was in that moment, I think, for me, it was like, oh, it really can't just be all of this in this particular moment. How do we lead to that? And what do we do if we're saying no prisons, that kind of thing? And, Elle, it was another conversation we were having where you said you were with the city council or the police board in Halifax, where you were talking about disarming and defunding the police, and they laughed at you. And then since post-COVID, we've been, having these conversations, and now the police board in Halifax is striking a committee to define what defund actually means. And, Desmond was talking about this earlier about how, these systems are now coming in to take our words, if you will, and do with them something that is not action, right? That's not actionable. That's actually not about changing the very system we're looking to change. So I want to go back to this question from about audacity in the academy. What does it mean for Black and Indigenous people to have audacity in the academy? And I also wanted to think through the ways in which women's bodies are policed in not only in the academy, but in these ways, right? That there are particular ways that Black and Indigenous women are expected to behave, not by us, but maybe by other people, sometimes by us. So how can we think through that together? What does it mean for Black and Indigenous people to have audacity in the academy? So important. And how do we respond to the ways in which our bodies are policed?
I think that the point that Elle makes about the politicization of repoliticizing the idea of self-care and taking care of yourself so you can take care of others in a way that is good and kind, and coming to them, meeting them where they're at is really important. Even just thinking and talking about like school and academia right now, I can feel my shoulders getting tense. This is why I decided to take some time off, because I spent my whole life in the academy, and I needed to step outside. And once you step outside that bubble, it's actually extraordinary how much people not inside the bubble don't care about the bubble. So and then when I meet up with my academic friends, we're always just talking academics. And I try to burst us out of until let's talk about something else, like freedom. I don't know, something other than the endless paperwork we have to do. But the idea of audacity, I think that having the audacity to simply be in that space is a form of resistance for a lot of people. I know a lot of young Indigenous people who really want to go to school, and I am not the person to tell them that they don't have to, but I will be there for them when inevitably, unfortunately, they come to me or make a Facebook post or something and say, had an awful day in class today. My white professor said all these myths about Indigenous people, which has happened more than once. And so maybe academic doulas. And I see that as my role sort of right now. Audacity.
Academic doula, I love that.
Yeah.
Academic doula, absolutely.
I mean, as Erica said, it's just our being is audacity. How dare we be as a Black woman? And there's no way to be that isn't seen as audacious in some way, right? So even when you're talking, if you don't talk professionally, then there'll be a million comments oh, I can't believe she's an academic and she's talking like that. But then the minute you use even a 2-syllable word, everyone's oh, see, this is the academic language we're talking about, right? So you can't even open your mouth, and whatever way you open your mouth, someone's going to have some critique about how you're either not authentically how they imagine Blackness to be, or you're not professional, or you're not in the space in the right way. So we have to always recognize, and this isn't just in the academy, this is in life. We're not supposed to be here. I had a friend, Keisha, that always used to say that when you're how's it going? She'd be I'm alive and I'm not supposed to be. We're quite literally, the descendants of the people who didn't jump into the sea, who didn't jump off the cliff, who weren't whipped to death, And so our being here is a rebuke, and it's audacity in itself. But that doesn't mean that therefore our very being is always resistance and everything we do is inherently political. So we could just sit here and be like, my existence is resistance, because it's not. We actually do have to organize for resistance, right? You can't just be like, my identity is just personally resistant. That's not actually true. So that's where I think a different form of, if you want to call it audacity, bravery comes in, which is difficult. Again, I mean, it goes back to wanting, you know, I mean, I'll sit on this and say all these things, and then I'll be mad a year later when I go for a job and I just mysteriously don't get it because like some dean watched this chat and I critique the academy, you know, but you have to decide what's important to you. And that does, I think, especially as Black people, as Indigenous people, it requires a lot of bravery to really think that through. You know, and to sacrifice. This is something Desmond Cole says, you know, we're not religious, we may not be religious, but if you really want to do this work of liberation, it requires us to sacrifice ourselves every day and die in particular ways for the things that we won't have, for a world we won't see. You know, because I'm not going to see the world I want to see tomorrow. And I have to wake up every day and fight for it. And that means if I'm doing it the right way, yes, I have to sacrifice things. And I have to be brave enough to do that. I'm brave enough to divest myself from white supremacy, which is calling all the time. If you would just do this, you could make all this money. I know I could make money consulting for the police if I really wanted to. I could make money consulting for corporations. You know, I'm bomb at like media relations and stuff if I wanted to do that, but I choose not to because it's not a choice that allows me to live the life I want with integrity. And that is more important. It's more important for me. And it's a struggle. I'm not saying it's easy, and it's something I struggle with all the time, but it's more important for me to find myself into relation with the things I want to fight for, the people who are being deported, the people who are in prison. So the last thing I want to say about the academy is like, you know, these aren't, all the real classrooms aren't within the university, right? Everything else isn't just a side hustle. And, you know, even when I'm talking about reading and stuff, I'm not just talking about that for, you know, people that have PhDs. There's people in prison doing reading circles of Frantz Fanon that are explaining this to each other and understand how that relates to their lives. The guys in prison that call me, they're like more up on the news and up on what's happening than me. They're teaching me. They call me up and have ask me questions like, we're having an argument about whether Black people are settlers. And like, what do you think? This person thinks this and this person thinks this, because they're watching and they're thinking and they're reading. And I think it's a real, like, what's elitist is when we believe that only learning belongs to some people, reading only belongs to some people, language only belongs to some people. It belongs to us all. And the academy is everywhere if we want it to be. People who are incarcerated have the ability, often more than us, to do that work because they're living in oppression. They understand in a real way what these things we're talking about mean. They're not just talking in theory about what it means to live under state power. They understand what it means to try and transform yourself, and they understand what it means to have done harm and to take accountability, and they're living that out in real ways. So I think that, you know, like this knowledge that we talk about, this reading, this you know, everything that I'm talking about here isn't something that I believe lives in one place. I believe it lives everywhere, and we actually have to have the bravery too to take it outside and to like let it go into the world and to do what we can to give it to other people. So finding our way outside, I think, detaching ourselves, especially like my mom's an immigrant. So every time, like the notion of like not having a job or like not having these things is really frightening to me. I was raised with that. Like I'm always amazed when people are like, oh, I moved across the country, I didn't have a job. I'm like, how did you do that? You know, because that lives in me, that real sense of like your ancestors died so that you could be successful. So be successful in these ways. And I have to fight that every day. And like bravery for me in that sense, the audacity for me is every time I'm able to overcome that and fight that in myself and fight that kind of sense of worthlessness the academy's put into me when I don't have, you know, the papers in the same way, or I don't have tenure in the same way. And then when I'm able to do that and then actually fight for liberation, I think that's when I feel that, you know, where I'm experiencing the most bravery or audacity in my own life.
I'm so, thank you both so much. We're just in Halifax, it's about 20 after 4. In Toronto, it's 20 after 3. Erica, I'm terrible at math. What time is it for you? 20 after 12?
1.
20 after 1. Okay, 20 after 1. So I say this because we have about another 35 to 40 minutes in our teach-in today. You know, there's a few things that are swirling in my mind. I'm not sure if it's quite a question, but I want to share them because I think we've touched on them in different parts. You know, I think about when I was an undergrad student at York University back in the day, when Black students were racially profiled in the York Lanes, I think, or the student building. I can't remember what it's called now. Being asked to provide identification that proved that they were students, and there was a whole action around that. So, and then when students were responding to that, saying, "Why are you asking me this?" And more students were like, "You know, you're to security officers, you can't be asking us this." Their response was to call for more security and eventually police. I think about, you know, this is police on campuses is not a new thing. And so I think about these tensions around some of us who believe that in order to be safe in the classroom as Black and Indigenous and people of color, that we need police to protect us, and others who are like, in order to be safe in the classroom as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we absolutely do not need police to protect us. And then I think about the ways in which our inboxes in our emails have been used to transmit for us and transfer for us all of this hate mail, where they, you know, threaten us with bodily harm, threaten to kill us, you know, share with us all the racial epithets they've just learned or looked up on the internet, or that they wanted to say to us in person, or call us from across the country or across North America to leave those racist messages for us on the phone. And how sometimes that goes up because we've been on the news trying to explain something, or because we've written an article, or because we're on a teach-in that's being broadcast in wide spaces. And I think it kind of speaks to audacity. You know, like I think about the ways in which I've been told to stop swearing on the internet and stop swearing online. And so now I use emojis to swear for me. But ways in which, you know, it's respectability comes at us a lot in many different ways, right? So whether or not we're too sexual, overly sexual, who's gays, what gays, you know, how we are responsible for catching COVID, sexual assault, dying, that we are responsible for these things that happened to us. We're not victims. We you know, we never get to occupy the place of being a victim in that. And so, you know, today, right, like in this piece around violence and anti-Black violence and colonization and misogyny and racist violence, I guess as a doula, as an academic doula, or as, you know, someone who is speaking to your students, right? We have to do these, what are they called? Teaching philosophies. As someone who's teaching to your students, what is it that you would want them to take, right? Like, what is it? Because we all know that what the work we're doing in our classroom and on the university is also the work that we're doing in community. We don't see that as a border, right? We understand that we still live in community while we're, you know, working in universities. What is it that, you know, you would want to support or remind people of or learn that are in your university classes about what they come with, but also about, you know, what you hope they leave with?
I mean, I think the best profs I had, it wasn't so much what you learned. And I had a prof that said, people only remember your stories and just, you know, tell stories in class. And that's what everyone will remember, your storytelling. But what I remember was the people that modeled compassion to you know, that made you feel seen. I was the kid that like went to all my profs' offices and like, you know, talked about the books I was reading because I was like so excited to have somebody that could talk books with me. You know, I was like that kid. And that was a prof. I'm like, it hated me. I feel like trying to, you know, have my Tim Hortons and then there would I be in the office, you know, but that was really important for me. It really gave me a critical mind. And I didn't have Black profs. These were like white profs. But what mattered to me was that, you know, they cared about my learning. And I think in everything really. And I think a lot of activism is this too. Like I would say 90% of activism is listening to people. And then out of what you're hearing, you'll be like, that's a thing that happens. We need to fight that, you know? But it's hearing stories. It's really listening to people and having people feel seen. I think when we talk about who is an activist, we have to believe we're significant in order to believe that we can, you know, do the work we need to do. So part of, especially when working with younger people, is like, you know, are we able to uphold younger people and just be like, you know, let me cradle you and let you go, you know, like, yeah, let me support you in doing this thing, which is difficult, right? And so for students, I hope, I don't know if I always do this the way I want to, but, you know, I think if you could show people care in the classroom, you know, compassion for themselves, and then model passion and then critical thought, which, you know, when we're talking about fighting systems, if we can't ask the right questions, you know, it's not this mystery when people are sometimes like, you know, how come you went to like the police board in January and you're on this defunding thing? I'm like, because I talk to people, you know? So it's not like all of this work comes out of my head. If you're in 2020, none of this work is coming out of your head. It's coming out of, you know, a long line of people from, you know, our great grandmothers who whispered the word of liberation when they were enslaved. You know, that's what we're living out. We're living out that word right now, you know? But like, we're not making this stuff up, but what we do is talk to each other, learn to ask the right questions, think through things with each other, you know, put in the time, whatever that research looks like, and it can be on the ground. It shouldn't all be from books, certainly, you know, whether that's, you know, and like having people that check you, know, the guys in prison that will be like, yeah, did you get that from a textbook? Like, where did that come from? You know, and being willing to be taught by other people, sitting with elders. Elder Black women are your best teachers. You know, they know everything and there's nothing they haven't seen. So anything you're struggling with or trying to understand, they've lived. And there's no point in pretending it didn't exist and trying to rework that out yourself. Go and talk to people, right? So I think teaching models that. If we can model that for other people, just a love of learning, the importance of a critical mind, and the importance of care and compassion for each other, that's where I think, you know, the classroom is a space, but we also have to acknowledge that it's a very traumatic space. It's a space that doesn't accept people with disabilities, right? It's a very ableist space. Even the technologies we use, you know, and that reinforces all kinds of ableism. You know, it's obviously a racist space. It's obviously a colonial space. It's a space that people quite literally in the level of, can my body sit in this chair comfortably? You know, like that's not even like, we're not even at that level of making sure everyone can enter the classroom in a way that they can be physically present, you know? So I don't want to hold it up in a way that doesn't acknowledge all these things. But, you know, when I think of what learning was important to me, like the things I took away, it's not that I learned this book or that book. It was that I learned how to think about it. And I want that quality to be within our movements, because if we can't think, we can't just say that like everything is activism and we can just do anything and like let's all just be out here being a mess and then like let's call that whatever, right? We actually have to have strategy and tactics. We have to outthink the oppressor because they're thinking 24/7. So we have to be thinking. We can't be redoing work that's already done and like wasting our energies. We have to understand that our energy is valuable and we have to put it in the right places and we have to put it in organized places together. So that stuff can come from when we kind of, like, there's a difference between discipline, and this is the last thing I'll say, sorry, Erica. I think we confuse discipline with authoritarianism, right? So we think that to talk about discipline is to be authoritarian, and we don't want that because that's punishment and police. But discipline is actually really important in movements. The ability to sit there and discipline our mind to do difficult things that we don't want to do. The ability to sit there and say, Netflix is on, but I'm actually going to try and pay attention to this thing. Those are skills that we take into our movements, because we have to discipline ourselves to be out on the streets when we don't want to, and discipline ourselves to meet with each other when we're tired, and discipline ourselves to take the call from prison or for the person being deported when we're like, oh, I just want to take a nap, you know. And if we don't discipline ourselves into that, if we don't value ourselves and each other to do that work, then we'll just always be doing superficial work over here, like, you know, the hashtag work. And I'm not saying there's not a value in that. It can be important, right? But like, we'll only ever be at that level. We'll never get to that deeper level. So we have to be careful. Like, discipline is important, and it's not authoritarianism. And those are things that we can teach ourselves and be taught by others.
Yeah, picking up on the point of discipline, I really like that idea because for me, when I took my grad courses in Toronto, I realized very quickly how narrow my perception of the universe was, especially in terms of Black and Indigenous solidarity. So I made it sort of my goal to catch up and to read Black feminist authors and Black thinkers just on my own time, recognizing that my theory and my work will not be complete and will not be something that I'm proud of now that I know what I'm missing from it. So I think the concept of discipline is so important for that. And it has also helped me notice so much what is missing from movements that I'm a part of, so Indigenous movements, and the work that Black feminists have done, Black and queer feminists have done to bring us to this point. And whenever I feel really discouraged, that's what I think of. Like Elle said, if you're in 2020, none of this is coming out of your own head. We aren't alone, and we have all of these predecessors and folks we're working with and beside. And just the other day, Catherine McKittrick tweeted out a Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote that stuck with me about abolition. And I had never thought of abolition like that. And I had the same issues in dealing with the media and getting the questions from the media that were like, but what about the killers? What about the rapists? What about the really dangerous people? And which obviously there's a huge problem in that, because it's always the othering. But the quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore is, "Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. Abolition is about presence, not absence. Abolition is about presence." And I think of that all the time.
Wow, I remember that tweet. I always feel like I haven't read enough, right? That I'm in these conversations, but I also feel like I need to read more. And, my mother was an English teacher, so there were always books and these demands to read. We have a question from YouTube. What is your take on violent resistance? Do you think the struggle should be non-violent always? And it reminded me of the book As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Liberation. But I'll leave that to you. Do you think the struggle should be non-violent always?
I feel like I don't want to give a 15-minute answer, so let me try and compress. So, I mean, first of all, what do we think of violence? And there's a really good discussion. I was just checking the YouTube, I try to read the YouTube comments, and a lot of people are talking about the point of, how we define looting, as poor people, taking something from a store, and not these billionaires taking all this money out of the bailout, right? And it's the same thing with violence, right? So we talk about violent protesters and not about the violence that police do, like literally every day as part of their jobs, that we just say is them doing their jobs and you should have respected them, or you should have reached for your phone, or, so we accept that violence and then talk about, oh, well, are you going to be nonviolent? Angela Davis has that great answer that she gives in the Black Power mixtape, right? When they ask her about violent resistance, and she says, like my father had to go get a gun because of these white terrorists, like outside our community, burning down our churches, and you ask me about violence, right? How are you going to ask Indigenous people about violence in a country literally that only exists as a country because of the daily violence done to Indigenous communities, to Indigenous people, the constant violence that is like embedded in our system, that is violence. But I think of South Africa, everyone with Nelson Mandela now, where everybody's like, oh, Nelson Mandela, and conveniently forgets that he was, MK, right? Like the sphere of the nation, where they realized there was a point where this nonviolent resistance was not working, and they turned to things like bombing the telegraph lines and taking out businesses and property. Some people have pointed out that Martin Luther King could be nonviolent because there are people outside the meetings with guns making sure that people didn't come in to harass him. So I think when it comes to Black people, what I'm saying here is, this goes back to my point, is that we get violence done to us, and then we're only human if we're able to reach inhuman levels of forgiveness for that. If South Africa apartheid was happening to white people, people wouldn't be like, oh, just go to court and just sit on the stand and talk about how awful what happened to you was. They're not even going to show up, right? The white people didn't even show up to sit there as people sat there and talked about being tortured and everyone who was killed. And then they're like, and it's both sides because Winnie Mandela is going to be here too. So that's what we got. And then we're pretending that's successful, even though white people in South Africa own more land than they did, own more wealth than they did under apartheid. Even though miners are being gunned down now by the ANC, who have adopted that kind of dominance and just gone into the position of the white elite. elite and taken the spoils of that and given nothing to the Black people. You have a country where there's protests right now because in an 80% Black country, you have a hairdresser talking about a hairdressing chain, talking about Black hair is damaged and white hair is normal and healthy in a Black majority country. So what did it mean for us to gain freedom? And when we hold that up and we say, and now Indigenous people in Canada, truth and reconciliation, oh, let's just have that, so before we start talking about our violent resistance, or whether we should be violent or whether we're violent or what we should do, we still haven't even talked about the violence that's being done to us. So we are never, ever, ever able to even mention or talk about or be angry about or want to, get justice for, because we're supposed to just forgive and move on. And then that's when we're being wonderful. Isn't that wonderful how Nelson Mandela forgave the people that held him in prison for 27 years? And that's the ideal of Blackness, right? So when is this violence, when is there a reckoning with the 500 years of violence that have been done to us? And then what would be a sufficient or insufficient amount of response from us? But the last thing I'll say there is I don't want to have a personal opinion on that, because if any opinion you didn't have, you have to be willing to do it. And would I be willing to commit violence? No. So I'm not ever going to speak theoretically about something that I wouldn't put my own body on the line for. Like if I'm going to tell somebody to go and do something, I have to be first in the line willing to do that. I personally, like when the cops go get on the sidewalk, I'm on the sidewalk. I don't want to go to the jail that I'm talking to the prisoners to, I don't want to be in Burnside where no, so I would never advocate for somebody else to do something that I'm not willing to do. If we're not putting our body in the place first that we're talking about, then we have no right to talk to other people about what they should or shouldn't do. But we know that Black people, violence is Black people, women talking in a loud voice, violence is Black women looking at you, we are seeing the violence that is being done to us is always projected onto us. And then we're treated as though we are the source of that violence. So we're always criminalized as violence. We're always seen as a threat as violent. And the minute we get together, that's a gang. And the minute we hit the streets, that's looting. So we can't even have a conversation about violence without talking about how anti-Black racism has created that violence and does violence upon us. So again, a kind of complex answer. I know people want these simple answers, and I never have simple answers because Black people have been talking about this again for generations, Fanon versus MLK, this is not, a new conversation. And ultimately it's also a strategic conversation. What gets us where we want to go? Is it an ethical conversation about should we do violence ethically, or is it a conversation about what happens when violence happens? Then that brings the state down on us in particular ways. But yeah, for me, no, I don't. I couldn't. So how could I ask anybody else to? But that doesn't mean I think that the Algerian Revolution was wrong or that the MK was wrong. Black people, the myth that we got liberation without shedding a drop is a myth. It's not true. It's not true. So let's be honest about what brought us liberation as well.
Yes, absolutely. Erica.
I think that taking the lead from a lot of my ancestors who negotiated treaty and sort of held out until the last possible minute, and only when completely necessary to enact self-defense in the form of physical violence or whatever you want to call it. I agree with Al. I think it's one thing to say, and I've seen this, I've worked in organizing circles with so many often young men who have so much pent up energy and want to get out there and shake shit up. But the reality is we also need the guidance of our elders and our aunties, and we need to make movement spaces safe as well for children. My mom brought me to a lot of organizing meetings as a kid, and that's how I became an organizer too, or someone who was cognizant of the state of my community and the state of the world. So there are different tactics for different times. And there are also we need to make sure that there are always spaces available within the movement for women, for disabled folks, for people who are gender nonconforming, who are mad, or who are who use substances, who are unhomed, all of these things. And we can't ever let that like, we can't let them fall to the back of the line when we're busy marching down the street.
So important. I think sometimes in our urgent ways of wanting to respond, it's only when we look over our shoulder do we realize that we've left somebody behind and that we haven't moved more deliberately. And both you and Elle were saying that, right? Like taking, you know, we make mistakes in this work, taking more time, really making sure that we have multi-generations involved in the conversation, taking time to have the conversation, right? Encouraging the reading as community-led based, you know, activist practice. And then, you know, and then understanding that in that, that there will be, you know, sometimes people will take the work, that's being happening in the activist space into another realm that's perhaps more a business model, because we do have these desires to make sure that, you know, we can get recognition, we can have a house, we can, you know, go on vacation, like these things continue to feed into our brain. And then, you know, we make interesting choices sometimes. But the work that I think you all really spoke about here in many different ways was around acknowledging that, acknowledging the way in which those desires are used to kind of take us off track or deploy us against one another, and to confront that head on, to confront that directly in the most effective ways that we can, while we continue to think through the step-by-step process in abolition. And, you know, for this piece and other pieces, it's around making sure the police are disarmed, not just of weapons, but of the ability to use their bodies to kill, that they are defunded, not just a reallocation of funds, but quite literally that money comes out, right? That they are defunded, that they are dismantled, and that they are denounced, right? Denounced and disrupting this idea that just because we may know people who are police does not mean that policing is okay. That we, you know, that we should be more creative around what we should ask people to do other than being police officers. So it's about 4:42. And I'm wondering, so in Halifax, I'm in the Atlantic time zone. I'm wondering, Elle and Erica, if you have questions for each other.
I mean, Erica, we got a short bio, but I wondered if you could say more about the work you're doing right now.
Yeah, one of the major things that we've been working on out in Saskatchewan and the prairies is building abolitionist movements, which is so exciting because it's like, I don't want to say the first time because there's so many politics tied up in being the first for anything, but it's one of the first time in my life that I've seen such a push towards abolition, and like a mass of people coming together to name the violence of the Saskatoon police force, the RCMP. But it's also been like an extraordinarily hard time because like we're all facing quite similar situations, not parallel, not comparable, but the same kind of situations where just the other, I guess it was like a month ago now, we got a video, one of the organizations I work with got a video of police harming an Indigenous man. And so we spent like at least a month dealing with just that alone. And within the court systems here, and I'm sure I don't have to explain this to either of you, but just sitting in a courtroom and those uncomfortable chairs. And I love that part that you brought up, the uncomfortable chairs, and sitting in that courtroom and like defendant after defendant is an Indigenous person in the prairies. And it's just like these young Indigenous kids coming through. Often they're Afro-Indigenous. Often they're the darkest skinned Indigenous kids. And watching that is so exhausting. So just trying to build our networks up out here and prepare for the long haul, because we know, and again, it's the generational thing. There's a lot of younger organizers now. I'm not the baby organizer anymore. There are babies below me. I'm sorry, I hope none of them are watching. But I'm not the youngest organizer anymore. And a lot of the youngest organizers, you can see like the fire and the passion. And they just want to be out there every single day, doing something against to challenge the police brutality that our communities are facing. And being 30, I'm like, I'm so tired. And it's not even that old. But yeah, so that's what we've been doing. And it's an exciting time. It's a hard time. And at the same time, our communities are, I think, coming to a point where we're recognizing that our liberation is tied up in Black liberation. And so I see tons of Indigenous folks from community expressing solidarity with that. When a couple of years ago, there was just almost nothing. We were realizing now that the concepts of indigenization in the academy and reconciliation as like in the broader Canadian sphere are both inherently anti-Black concepts. They both leave out and marginalize Black people. And so we're refusing them on the basis of what they do to us, but also what they do to our kin. So yeah, I feel excited about the work today. How about you?
Yeah, I think as you said, it's like beautiful times and very difficult times. Sometimes you feel like the abolitionist hipster, you know, because it's like, I was in the abolition band before you were, but that's not because of gatekeeping. I think, you know, we have a real responsibility to try and, you know, bring what we have and teach other people. Because again, we're not going to get there tomorrow, you know, and we really, really have to think hard about what these solutions look like for ourselves as well. Some people like in the comments, like, well, just give us a guide. And it's like, well, do you know how to solve conflict? Do you know how to de-escalate conflict? You know, do you know how to deal with people who are making you uncomfortable because they have mental illness? Like, have you thought that through? Have you started a group in your community where you maybe talk to each other about problems in the community instead of calling the police immediately? Do you know how to talk to people around you? Do you know how to deal with your own escalation? Do you know how to deal with family violence? Like, these are things we can get training in. These are things that we can go and teach each other how to do. I have a friend that's the head of the inmate committee in a prison, and he's doing this work every day. You know, when he calls me up and just tells me about his day, he's like, oh yeah, the guards were shooting, you know, and then they called my name and I had to get up and negotiate everybody's way back into the prison. And, you know, there's these two guys that got in a fight and I'm getting them out of SEG. I'm going to teach them how to mediate. Like, these are real solutions. I really think it's important that we don't treat this as fantasy, as this thing that we're just talking about, that's this ponies and fairy dust. What's ponies and fairy dust is continue to invest billions, $20 billion a year in a punishment system that doesn't work, that doesn't bring any justice to our communities, that doesn't stop crime, that doesn't keep us safe. Like, it's not working. If it were working, we have zero tolerance on domestic violence. It's not going down because of prison. So that's not that we excuse domestic violence, it's that we're saying this isn't the solution that's going to end violence in our communities and homes. That this isn't the solution that's going to end the way that Black women's bodies are constantly subject, Black women, trans Black women, queer Black bodies that are constantly subject to violence. It's not being solved by this system. We don't want to excuse it. We want to do something better. And what's ponies and fairy dust is continuing to act like if we just invest more money in policing and more money in prisons, somehow that will magically solve the problem that it doesn't solve, instead of saying, we actually can learn how to de-escalate. We can learn how to deal with conflict. I always think about, you know, with Andrew Loku, how his neighbor said, you know, he was headed towards my apartment, you know, and I always knew how to talk to him and calm him down. And then the police, of course, showed up and shot him within 21 seconds without talking to him. I want us to do that work. And I'm not perfect at it. I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm saying I need to do this work as well. And we need to be humble in that as well, and talk to our elders and talk to other people, you know, and not be afraid of the difficult questions. I'm not afraid of the people that are like, well, you know, what about this, what about that? Yeah, those are real questions. We're going to have to work on them, you know, and I don't think we're living in a world where we're going to pretend those aren't real questions. But just because something's not worked out or something's complex doesn't mean we shy away from it, because we'd rather be correct in one way than live in a better world, you know? So for me, yeah, I think that I just want to talk about one more thing, sorry, because I know Desmond was able to fundraise a lot of money for Land Back Lane. I want to encourage people, since we're talking about violence, and of course, the conversation about violence always gets taken away from state violence and then onto us, like, what does Elle think about violence? And then if I don't say, all Black people must be 100% nonviolent all the time, or we're evil, then, you know, I'm promoting violence or something, or whatever the point of those questions is. But to talk about actual violence that's done to people, I wrote a story about Fatuma Abdi, the sister of Abdul Abdi. Abdul and Fatuma suing the Nova Scotia government for the neglect and abuse they experienced in the child welfare system. And Fatuma tells her story in an article I did for the Halifax Examiner. And part of that story, and this is important because when we're talking about ending funding to police or defunding police, you often are like, let's fund social workers. But of course, social workers are doing a tremendous amount of violence to Indigenous and Black people, particularly to mothers. And so Fatuma was taken into care. And then as she became a mother, her children were also stripped from her. And one of her children was killed in care, died in care. And they have not given her a headstone. When she asked for just a gravestone to mark her child's grave, the province refused. So there is a fundraiser going on for that. The Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland Nova Scotia is accepting donations in Fatuma's name. If you donate and say Fatuma, it's such a small ask, just, you know, a gravestone so this woman can visit her child who died in the child welfare system that was taken from her after all the abuse that she suffered in the system, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, the complete neglect. I don't have time to get into the whole story, but I just also want to raise that, of course, as another side of policing, right? Child welfare is a site of policing. The immigration system is a site of policing. These were refugees brought supposedly to flee violence and then were given this whole other violence as children. So if you do want to help out Fatuma on that, Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland Nova Scotia, donate in Fatuma's name. It would be much appreciated.
Thank you, absolutely. And if you get a chance, maybe someone can put the link in the YouTube chat for the article in the Halifax Examiner that Elle wrote about Fatuma Abdi, and then someone else can put the link if you can, that'd be great. So in the time of police violence, continued police violence, we've had the pandemic, we've had COVID-19 that has negatively impacted our communities, Black and Indigenous and people of color communities, more so than other communities in Canada. And what we're seeing is the increasing policing around COVID, right? Policing around whether or not people are breaching the protocols, outing and naming communities that may have clusters where where the state, where the province and chief medical officers are naming communities, not as communities who've been victimized by COVID, but communities that are now dangerous and will bring COVID to others. We've seen the issue with Dr. Ngola in New Brunswick, where he was named and received death threats and has now left his community. And Dr. Ngola provided community care to remote communities on the border of New Brunswick and Quebec. And then we see this young man in PEI, Javon, who was actually incarcerated. Part of that reason was the belief that he had breached the COVID protocols. I mention it now because we're having students, international students, returning to our campuses. Many of our students staying local to go to university. And one campus, St. FX in Nova Scotia has actually contracted to work with RCMP to check to make sure that students aren't breaching quarantine protocols. I know we just have a few moments, but I think we need to speak about just the ways in which this fear around COVID, and we get it, like it's a scary virus and disease, but how Black and Indigenous and people of color are being subjected not only to the virus, but to the racism that's accompanying that virus and the continued policing and now incarceration of people who have the virus, who are thought of to now be weaponizing the virus against, the innocent general public. So I just want to know what's happening in your communities or what your thoughts are around that. I know, again, huge question. 5 minutes.
Erica, you're first.
What's happening? I think that people honestly are trying to survive. Al keeps being like, let's not do hashtag activism. And I'm like, let's talk about Twitter. But I've been thinking about like social media and online interactions as very crucial during the pandemic to me. And generally, because I have mental health issues, like sometimes my anxiety is too bad to like go out, but I can always like text my friend from the comfort of my own bed. And so I've been thinking about the role of social media and technology in keeping us together and building communities. And the reality, of course, being that a virtual community lacks a lot of the elements of real in IRL communities, and we have to recognize those limitations as well. I think that when people think of the internet, they think of an empty floating cloud space that exists nowhere. But the reality is that in order for us to be having this conversation right now, there are servers on Indigenous lands built by workers with tiny little chips, probably built by factory workers. Yeah, I'm just thinking about all the different ways we can make community in a crisis like this. But also recognizing that the community is incomplete because most of the people I see who are my friends who are getting COVID are primarily Black folks, which is devastating. And I'm just like shocked at how little media coverage is devoted to that. Yeah.
In the sort of 1 minute that we have before we have to wrap up, something that came out of COVID that Adil Abdullahi, who's on one of the later chats, and I are doing is called No Life Left Behind, Conversations on Life. So it's a series we do around lifers that came out of, and this is really important for the abolition conversation. When releases were happening from provincial jail, there was a lot of, okay, we're gonna get rid of we're gonna release the non-violent people. And of course, abolition becomes challenged in this space. We're like, well, what about the people who have committed violence? What does that mean for our politics? So we're having that conversation in a series of conversations with people who are doing life, people who are on parole from life sentences, people who work on the issue of life sentences in Canada. So really trying to think about those difficult issues of incarceration. It's called No Life Left Behind. We set up different events for them every Monday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Atlantic. We have lawyers, we have lifers, we have voices from prison, we have advocates, and we're just trying to really think together about what abolition means for the life sentence, for people that have committed violence, for our own relationship to those things. So check that out. That's with me and Adil Abdullahi, streamed live on Facebook every Monday night. So I just wanted to say that. And then the last thing I'll say as far as COVID is that we know that a long logic of racism is that logic of contamination, of hygiene, right? So we are always seen as dirty, and we have always been seen as both spreading disease and then like spreading our Blackness or our Indigenousness to other people, right? That we contaminate people. So you hear hip hop and then you commit crimes, right? So this is the contamination argument, and we're seeing it brought back through COVID, through, when we're called reckless and selfish and partying in North Preston. But, those snowbirds who come back are just, like, let's not stigmatize people. So we're again seeing this whole thing around who spreads disease, and that Blackness itself has always been seen as something that contaminates others and spreads disease, and therefore must be criminalized. And this is why we see this heightened policing, with this idea that we can police our way out of a pandemic. Because when we feel out of control, when we feel threatened, we always turn to a punishment response instead of a care response. So yeah, I think that we notice that. And then of course, we know that people in so many institutions, not just prisons, but things like forensic institutions, psychiatric hospitals, homes that have become carceral for old people, elders. I don't want to use old people for elders. We know that these are where we're seeing so much disease and so much death. And so I want us to remember that we are only in this idea of public safety that we think is only controlled by policing. We are actually only as safe as the least protected, the least loved, the least housed, the least cared for among us. And COVID has showed us this. So the last thing I'll say in the abolition conversation is, if not for other people, for ourselves, COVID has showed us that the safety and security of our society actually depends upon our ability to care for each other. And that is part of an abolition conversation as well.
Okay, that was all of it. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled that I got a chance to, be here and help moderate the questions and all that you had to offer. So for everyone watching, as part of the Scholars Strike, there's more.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but I never said I meant to say hi, gender and law students.
I know all the classrooms that are tuning in. There's a set of panels later today, tomorrow. Scholar Strike Nova Scotia is on at 2:00 Atlantic time. Check the Facebook page for the link. We'll be streaming live onto Facebook, and we are working very diligently to have reps from each university in Nova Scotia as part of that Scholar Strike teach-in tomorrow. Scholar Strikes Nova Scotia. Erica Violet Lee, thank you. Thank you so much for all that you shared and offered, and the fierceness that you are. Elle Jones, thank you for all that you shared and offered, and the fierceness that you are. Much fierce love to you both. May we continue to be audacious. May we continue to be fierce, and may we continue to center care for ourselves so we can continue to do the care in and around our communities. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, OmiSoore, and thank you to everyone for all the tech and all the organizing, and everybody on the YouTube chat as well.
Yes.
I'm gonna follow some of the comments.
I know, right? To Beverly and Minsook and everyone responsible for getting this in place.